Journeys with God. Hey, welcome. We have another look into the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a higher standard each day and not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in life. Our series continues as we hear from family, friends, and others, all influenced by the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Well, we'll have two Gateway to Joy programs as we end one series and begin another. We'll wrap up Bringing Up Baby with our friend Arlita. Winston. Teaching your children quietness is their topic. And we'll begin a series called Journeys with God as we travel to India. Well, as we've been thinking about family life and training children, we'll hear from Elizabeth's daughter, Valerie Elliot Shepards, as she gives some of her testimony and talks about stepfather Addison Leach. Kathy Reeg, president of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, talks about Elizabeth and how she lived what she taught. That coming up later. First, though, let's wrap up our Bringing Up Baby series as we think about kids, bedtime, about how proper planning can make a big difference, about advice for a parent of a young child, teaching your children quietness.
You are loved with an everlasting love. This is God's word to us. He loves us, and underneath are His everlasting arms. This is your friend, Elizabeth Elliot, talking again today with Arlita Winston. Arlita, I have so many questions I'd like to ask you, and we just don't have that much time. But say a good friend of yours who has got her first child comes to your house, and this child, let's say, is about 14 months or 18 months old, and doing all kinds of things that you would never let your children do. What do you do?
Well, I think I would gather that child up in my arm first and start to play with him and say very gently, no, we don't do that. But here, let's do this. Suppose they were reaching for my crystal candy dish on the coffee table, and I would just scoop them up. I wouldn't wait for the mother. The mother is sitting back in the armchair, ready to enjoy her cup of tea, and she's finally got a break in her life, and she's going to come and sit and have a visit with me, and she's not thinking about that child at all. So I have to keep my eye on that child. Besides, I know that perhaps she doesn't generally keep that child from touching anything anyway, and so I have to be even more alert and treat that child as though that child were my own. But I realize that gets us into a very sticky position with the mother sitting there where I'm telling the child what to do instead of the mother. So I think what I would do is I would first mention to the mother, would you mind, I really would rather this child not do this. If I let her do it, I would have to let all my grandchildren do it, and let me show you a way that we find works in our household. And then I would proceed to do what I would normally do with my own. But I would bring it to her attention that we just don't behave that way in my household. After all, it is my home.
I think one of the most important things about teaching children not to touch things, and I'm very much against child-proofing a house.
I am too.
Because one of the most important things is what happens when they go to the grocery store, or what happens when they go to Aunt Susie's house or their grandmother's house. It's not child-proofed.
Right.
I have another question. Is it possible to teach children from the beginning to keep their voices down?
Not if you keep your voice up. I think that the child learns from the parents. And sometimes we as parents don't realize how the children are hearing us, and we'll raise our voices over and over again, and we'll get exasperated. And all we're doing is implanting into that child's mind that it's okay to do that. But then when they do it, we land on them like a ton of bricks. So I think the first question is, are we doing it? Are we throwing temper tantrums? Are we screaming at the children? When we want them to come down for supper, do we scream at them up to the second floor? Or do we walk to where they are? You could have a bell. And sometimes I would send a child with the dinner bell to call everybody. But to scream just invites them to scream back.
When children get excited in play, they often scream at the top of their lungs.
Right.
And my husband and I have many experiences of being in church basements when there's a church supper before or after a meeting where I'm speaking. It seems to be just the commonest thing that the children in the church are tearing around, screaming their heads off. Now, I think there may be a place for screaming, maybe out in the playground or in the backyard, but shouldn't they be taught to consider other people?
Well, yes, I think, though, that the adults need to do some organizing and planning to direct the children so that they don't just have a free-for-all.
The adults in the church, you mean in general, or do you mean the parents at home?
The parents. They need to provide direction for the children at that time. You can always have activities with you. You could have little puzzles or little things to draw on, whatever. I used to carry these around with me everywhere so that if the children had to be quiet for a while and out of the way, there was something that they could occupy their minds with and their hands with. I can remember a time when my son Brad, who was that little boy that we talked about years ago, sitting on the stool that I had to discipline so firmly for tearing his book. Well, now that Brad has 6 children of his own. And not long ago, I was with him and his wife down in Delaware. We were going into a decorator's shop because we were planning the decor for his medical office. He's a pediatrician down there. And I was appalled to think that we were going to have to take all 5 children, this is before they had their 6th, we had to take all 5 into the decorator's shop, and they were going to be there for 2 hours while Lisa and I selected colors and papers and pictures and et cetera, for Brad's office. I looked at them wide-eyed. I said, "You're going to take all 5 children with you?" And they said, "Of course, Mother." And so I swallowed hard, and I thought, boy, am I going to be able to pick out paper when I'm trying to watch these 5 grandchildren? And I thought, all right, let me see what happens. And we walked in there, and those 5 children, with just a look from their parents, sat down with their little satchels that they had all prepared before they came on this little journey. Their mother knew that they would have 2 hours with nothing to do but sitting. And they sat there sprawled on the floor and occupied themselves with their books and their crayons and their paper and their scissors. And for 2 hours, we did not hear a word from these 5 young children who all were under the age of, well, at that time, 9.
Well, that is remarkable, and I'm sure that they didn't leave a big mess for the people that owned the store to clean up.
No, in fact, the lady who was helping us with decorating, she says, "I'm changing to this pediatrician."
That was great advertising.
But what was lovely, I thought, and what was so rewarding to me, was to see my son carrying out the same kind of quiet control with the children, and yet they didn't feel controlled. They were doing something that they really enjoyed doing. Sitting quietly doing it. They knew that when we got home, their dad was going to be out playing ball or doing something with them, something rowdy, something noisy, that they didn't have to stay quiet for the whole long day.
So they're not suppressed, and it's not cruelty to children.
Not.
In fact, I've discovered that children really do appreciate quietness. When my grandchildren come here, I always remind them, when you come to our house, we're not going anyplace. We are not taking you to any kind of entertainment, and there is virtually nothing to do in our house. We have about 6 toys, maybe, altogether. And they all agree that they want to come to Granny's house. When I ask them why and remind them repeatedly about how little there is to do here, almost invariably they'll say, "Well, it's so quiet there. We like it there." Now, their home is peaceful, too, but there's a lot of coming and going when you've got 10 people in a family. I think it's so important to teach children quietness, stillness, physical stillness, the lack of motion, and the lack of noise, quietness.
And there's a balance to be achieved. When I walk into Brad and Lisa's home with their 6 children now, there is a lovely balance of a great many activities going on, but there's organization and there's a mother's hand behind it organizing so that certain ones are doing certain things and being at peace with each other.
Well, I saw the evidence of that in your family when those children were young. You had some teenagers then. But when you lived in that big house in Moorestown, New Jersey, you and I and Joe, your husband, sat in that little room with a fire by the fireplace and talked until about 10 o'clock, at which point I looked at you. I realized that there were, 5 children in the house, the oldest being about 15 at the time.
Right.
I suddenly looked at you and I said, "Where are the children?" And you said, "What time is it?" And I said, "Well, it's 10 o'clock. And you said, "Well, then they're in bed." I said, "You mean to tell me that you don't have to put them to bed or tell them it's time to go to bed?" And you said, "No, they understand this." Then I discovered the next morning when you told me that breakfast would be at 7:30, as we came down the stairs, you and I together, I assumed that you had been in the kitchen fixing the breakfast, but turned out you hadn't been. There were 3 children in the kitchen getting the breakfast. Somebody had set the table, somebody was doing sausages, somebody else had made the coffee, somebody was cutting up the fruit. The order and the peace and the smooth running of oiled wheels in that household, I've never forgotten. And one of the reasons, when I asked you and Joe how you did it, you looked blank, and you said, "How did we do what?" "Well, how did you create a home so peaceful and so well-ordered?" And you said, "Well, Joe and I just sat down and we talked about what kind of a home we wanted to have, and we just did it that way," which blew my mind. But then I remember Joe's remark. He said to me, "I didn't want to hate my children. I did not want to hate my children. And if we had to wrestle and tussle and grapple every evening after supper to make them do their homework, to make them practice the piano, make them practice the flute, make them pick up their toys, make them go to bed, and then try to drag them out of bed in the morning," he said, "I'd hate them.
Yeah.
I'd really hate them."
But that kind of commitment took dedication on both of our parts to be committed, knowing this was a very important thing in our lives for our children, to be responsive to us, because we also knew that this would teach them to be responsive to God. And we had to start really early. As early, I don't think I know how early it was. I just know it was very, very early to teach them responsibility, accountability. And I'm not saying that we did it all right. In fact, probably a lot of the things I learned from my mistakes. And by the time you have 5, you've learned a thing or two.
Well, the fruit is there, the evidence is there in your children, and thank God they are passing it on to their children as well. So I just want our listeners to be encouraged to believe that God is going to help you. It is God who made you parents. It's God who created that child. God wants to help you. He loves to answer your prayers.
The 5th in our 5-part series, Bringing Up Baby, with Arlita Winston joining Elizabeth Elliot, teaching your children quietness. Well, as we've been thinking about bringing up children, we'll hear from Elizabeth's daughter, Valerie Elliot Shepherd. She'll give some of her testimony of how she came to know Christ at an early age.
I'm going to share my own testimony. I call it my adult testimony, though I did give my heart to Christ in a serious way when I was 14. Now, everything my mother taught me and said to me as a child, I obeyed, I listened, I learned, I believed. So I believed that Jesus was my Savior. But at the ages of 10, 11, 12, we had moved to the States when I was 8 and a half. So I started 4th grade in a small public school, which was actually a good school. But when I began to go into adolescence, I was much more distracted by friends. When my mother remarried the second time, which was in January of 1968, Addison Leach, was a Presbyterian minister and professor of theology. And we lived in Franconia, New Hampshire, which is where we had been living. My mother and I had been living since 1963. that summer, we moved to Massachusetts because he was going to teach at Gordon Conwell Seminary, which is where my husband, Walt Shepard, went to seminary. So he sent me to a Presbyterian Christian youth missions conference. It changed my life. As I said, I certainly believed everything my mother had taught me, but sitting in church when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, it went in one ear and out the other. I remember just being cold in this little community church that had been started by Christian Women's Club in Sugar Hill, New Hampshire. I ate my mother's mints from her purse while she played the organ. And I was in Sunday school, and I remember being frustrated that I seemed to be the only one that wanted to answer questions. But I was basically bored in church. So when I went to this conference, it was about 300 high school students with some very good preachers, Jerry Kirk, Bruce Thielman, and the third one the name escapes me. But anyway, they were wonderful. And I'll never forget the singing of Christian hymns by those teenagers. They had the boys and the girls separated in the auditorium that we sat in. It was an outdoor auditorium. But we got to hear these 3 different preachers, and I knew the Lord was calling me to himself to be his disciple. And it was at that week that I understood I had to get more serious about learning his word, loving him, praying. So I was 14. And I'm very, very grateful that my stepfather sent me to that conference. That conference has been going on for about 120 years, Presbyterian Youth Conference.
Valerie Elliot Shepard. Later on, we'll hear about Elizabeth and issues she had related to her memory. But first, let's travel to India as we hear about Elizabeth and her experiences, about the difficulty in finding what airport to fly into, about the overwhelming millions in this foreign land, and about the relief from a huge sign with 4 important letters. Journeys with God, Part 1, India.
You are loved with an everlasting love. That's what the Bible says. And underneath are the everlasting arms. This is your friend Elizabeth Elliot, talking with you this week about journeys with God. Just a few days before I sat down to work on this week's talks, my daughter Valerie and her husband announced a startling piece of news. Another baby, number 9? No. Another church. Walt Shepard, my son-in-law, has been called to be the pastor of a church in South Carolina. He was a pastor for 10 years in California. And, of course, when there's a call to a different church, there are many questions and hesitations and prayers. I wonder if someone is listening today who is in a similar quandary. What to do? Where to go? A new job, perhaps? A move to another state? A move to a retirement home? That's a tough one, isn't it? Very difficult. My younger brother, he's only 13 months younger than I am, but he has had to move into a retirement home because of his wife's health. And my brother does a lot of traveling, and the doctor said you must not leave her alone, so she has to be in a place where help is readily available. And I sent to him a line from a poem that I had learned. Henceforth on earth no place shall I count strange, for every place belongeth to my Christ. I love that, and it brings me peace and assurance. Henceforth on earth no place shall I count strange, for every place belongeth to my Christ. My husband Lars and I have had more overseas trips this year than we have ever had before. And I do want to say that it is just as though the Lord has given us a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, as he gave to the Israelites, guidance in ways which seem to be perfectly clear. And we were so grateful for that. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, Moses is talking to the Israelites. He says, I'm now 120 years old. I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you. And the Lord will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, whom he destroyed. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. And in verse 8, he repeats those words, the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid or discouraged. I had an invitation that came by mail more than a year ago from an organization called the South India Prayer Fellowship. It was a Mrs. Cheladurai who wrote to me, and she could write fairly understandable English, but it was a different question when we tried to get on the telephone and find out exactly what airport we were to fly into. Well, Lars tried to talk to her. He tried every way in the world to understand what she was saying, but finally he said, "You talk to her." So I said, "Can you tell us which airport you would like us to fly into?" And she said, "Oh, Mrs. Elliot, we are so glad you are coming." And I said, "Thank you. Can you tell us which airport we need to fly into?" "Oh, the ladies are so excited that you are coming." And that really was about all we could get. So we had to leave the States not knowing if we were going to the right airport. We chose Madras, since that seemed to be the major airport that was closest to where we were going, but we weren't very sure as to exactly where we were going. But we had an engagement in Illinois first, and so we went from that engagement to the Chicago airport. We found that the flight was delayed. Perhaps we were going to miss our connection in Frankfurt. So I prayed, "Lord, when you put forth your sheep, you go before them." That was the Lord's promise. And so, Lord, I'm going to commit all this to you with a quiet heart. Well, I thought maybe you'd like to hear some entries from my journal. May 2nd. Spent a 4-hour night at the Hotel Centaur in Bombay. It cost us $240. A 4-hour night. Now we are en route to Madras, where we hope to be met and taken to the conference site. The teeming millions, each one loved with an everlasting love. And what of their future? How will Christ claim his earthly heritage? Surely there are unimagined glories yet to be known. Saturday morning, May 3rd. 80 women of the Women's Prayer Fellowship of the Church of South India in Tirunelveli Diocese, Madras. They dressed me in a sari. You know what the sari is, that beautiful, most feminine of all feminine garments. It's an 18-foot-long piece of material, one single piece of material. It took them about 15 minutes to wrap and pleat and wind it around me. And they used a few safety pins, too. So there I was, trying to learn to walk in a floor-length sari. We had lunch in someone's home, and again saw the teeming millions as we drove from the YWCA to the church. It was staggering. The poverty, the filth, the noise, the wild drivers, indescribable. Sunday, May 4th, we were up at 4:15, went to the railroad station at 5 o'clock. At least 10,000 people were there, a good many of them asleep on the concrete floor. There were porters in short skirts and red turbans balancing 3 suitcases on their heads and carrying 1 or 2 in their hands. The station was patterned after those vast ones in Europe. Our escorts were Princess and Daisy. And I forgot to mention that the Lord did answer our prayers most wonderfully. When we got off the plane in Madras, the first thing that we saw after we got through customs was a huge sign with G-R-E-N. That's my last name, you know. My husband's name is Lars Grin, and I am Mrs. Lars Grin. And here were 2 charming Indian girls, 26 and 27 years old, beautiful girls, dressed in saris, and they were holding up the sign. So the Lord had answered our prayer that we got to the right airport. Well, the train pulled out at 6 o'clock. We had an 8-hour ride through rural country. Palm trees, banana groves, rice fields, sugar cane, vegetables, tiny leaf shacks, very like some of the Auca shacks in the jungle where I lived in Ecuador years ago. Adobe houses, goats, cattle, bullocks, all terribly skinny. All the women wear saris all the time, no matter how back-breaking the work or how muddy and filthy they get. And we saw women swinging pickaxes on the railroad and carrying concrete in wooden bowls. We arrived at Coimbatore, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, at 2 o'clock, and we were met by Tom, a kind Christian man. Our two guides, Princess and Daisy, have accompanied us everywhere, and they stayed at the Y with us in Madras. May 5th, we were in Pollachi, 9:30 a.m. at the same church where we were last night. Women all sitting cross-legged on the floor for hours. They were sitting on concrete virtually all day long, their backs perfectly straight. And they sang, and did they sing, very loud, a very nasal kind of singing, as it seemed to me, led by a trio in pink chiffon saris, accompanied by drums and tambourines, seemingly tireless, verse after verse after verse. I spoke on spiritual mothering. I had an excellent interpreter, Karuna Haran, a gracious man who speaks excellent English. After the meeting, he came to our suite and talked of a primitive tribe of Stone Age people, the Harawas, on the island of Nicobar. Missionaries are forbidden to seek to reach them because the government wants to preserve their culture. The bush police shoot people who try to go in there. Our lunch was vegetarian rice and tea. How I'm tempted to pamper myself. Am I a soldier of the cross, a follower of the Lamb? Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease while others sought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas? Well, you can guess that comes from an old hymn that's in my head. I'm not merely tempted to pamper myself. I confess that I succumbed. A dead man lay by the roadside. A few people were apparently very casual about it. The patient, hard-working bullocks, heavy yokes rubbing their necks with each step, were everywhere. The phone rang very early the next morning. A voice said, "Newspaper door open." And I said, "I beg your pardon?" "Newspaper door open." Well, I opened the door, and there stood a boy with a newspaper. My final talk was on the subject of suffering. Lars's 20 minutes talk, which he did with great ease and humor, as always, was a simple testimony of his growing up, the times that God has preserved his life, the providential preparation for the job that he now has. Such a lovely reminder of God's ways. All the way my Savior leads me. That's a hymn that kept going over and over in my mind. God was faithful. I'll be talking again tomorrow about journeys with God.
A look at India as we've begun a 5-part series, Journeys with God. Well, as our journey takes us closer to the end of our time, we have about a minute and a half to hear from Kathy Reeg. Kathy is the president of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation. Kathy and her husband Dave were great friends to Lars and Elizabeth, especially during Lars' final days. Did you know that Elizabeth dealt with memory issues late in life? Well, Kathy, who's the president of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, talks about how Elizabeth took the initiative to find out what was going on. How did she meet the bad news that she received?
It was Elizabeth who recognized that she was putting things in wrong places and not remembering things. She went to the doctor herself. No one coerced her or no one told her to. She went. And so when she found out, she knew. And they discussed it with the diagnosis at first, but it was just allowing God to walk through that process with them. And she fully surrendered. Whatever that looked like, she did. That's pretty powerful because a lot of people don't accept that or don't accept a diagnosis of whatever it might be. God could have healed her. And I think, I know that was Valerie's prayer all of the rest of her life, that God would heal her. She lived out what she taught. I mean, she really, really did. It wasn't as easy as maybe it appeared to be, even in later years, and not just with dementia, but in relationships. And she was committed to Jesus, and she was committed to the vows she made, and she continued. And that's how she could write as well as she could write, because she was living out much of that on a daily basis.
Kathy Reeg, president of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation. Well, our time is coming to an end, but I do have time to thank you for letting us come into your home, to join you in your office, or maybe you took a walk, wherever we found you. On behalf of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out all the resources at elizabethelliot.org. That's elizabethelliot.org for more talks, devotionals, videos, and other Gateway to Joy programs. Hey, if you get a chance, leave a review for us wherever you found this program today. Thanks. Well, until next time, may God remind you each and every day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms